Welcome back. In this video, we'll have a look at Locke's argument for the limited government and the limits of political obligation. Recall that in the last knowledge clip, we saw how for Locke, people act in a relatively peaceful manner, even in the absence of a supreme power, and form voluntary associations. In the state of nature, people respect the natural law and the rights of others, and this view distinguishes Locke from Hobbes. Locke argues that only if individuals violate their natural duties and try to dominate each other, they exit the state of nature and enter into the state of war. So for Locke, rational people obey the law of nature, create reciprocal relationships among each other, and build functioning trading networks, for instance. However, there's always someone who spoils the game, someone who acts irrationally, breaks his contracts, steals, and murders. Insecurity in the state of nature is also for Locke a major issue and a reason for rational persons to agree to form a government. Let's now in this knowledge clip follow Locke's argument for what motivates the transition from the state of nature to the civil state, and what kind of government a rational person would accept. If for Hobbes the answer is absolutism, for Locke it's moderation. Political power must be limited, and individuals can criticize a government that violates their natural rights. After watching this knowledge clip, you'll be able to meet the third learning goal of this week. This means that you can explain Locke's argument for why the power of the government and the state more generally must be limited, and why people's duty to obey the commands of public authorities is not absolute, but they can criticize and even disobey them in certain situations. You'll also have resources to meet the fifth learning goal, the comparison between Hobbes and Locke. Again, please read the longer quotes at your own pace. I won't be reading them out loud. Here, again, the nutshell version of Locke's political theory. We'll cover the points 4 to 7 in this video, so I proceed in 4 chapters. Okay, let's get to it and see how the argument unfolds. The first chapter is how people make a social contract to establish an impartial judge to solve their conflicts better than they are able to themselves in the state of nature. Although Locke thinks that in the absence of government and political organization, self-interested and rational people organize spontaneously among themselves and, generally speaking, obey the natural law, there are always exceptions. Some people don't respect other people's rights, they break contracts and take what belongs to others. They act in a manner that Locke finds irrational, as their actions are in violation of the natural law. Note that for Hobbes, it was rational in the state of nature to act to one's own advantage and harm others, if one deemed it necessary for one's own survival. So interestingly, Locke seems to think that this is not the case. Only irrational people violate their natural duties to respect the rights of others. So Locke believes that although in a state of nature there is no government nor police, it is not a lawless situation. Locke thinks that the state of nature is regulated by the natural law. For this reason, he also argues that individuals can punish those who make the crime of reason and violate the natural law. So when a common law enforcement is lacking, everyone has the right to act as a judge. As you remember, Hobbes had argued that the concepts of crime and punishment only make sense in the civil state, when there is a common authority to enact, interpret, and enforce the law. Locke seems to think a bit differently and says that it is at least a moral crime to act against the natural law. My rights can be violated even in the state of nature, and if this happens, if somebody steals my property, I have the right to take justice in my own hands, go after the thief and punish that person, even by death if necessary. Locke did recognize that it might be rather difficult to enforce one's rights in the state of nature and also dangerous. What if a group of persons burns my house down and with it everything I own? How would I effectively enforce my natural rights in such a situation? Locke also noted that it was a significant drawback of the general right to enforce the natural law that everyone could act as a judge in their own case and therefore be biased to favor themselves. People have different interpretations of what respecting the rights of others mean or what the contracts to which they have voluntarily agreed entail in different situations. The state of nature lacks impartial, known, and consistent laws and law enforcement to impartially deal with conflicts of interest between people. For these reasons, Locke argued that it is indeed the establishment of the judiciary that is the main reason for people to get out of the state of nature. People need a neutral third party to interpret what natural rights and contracts mean in specific situations and solve conflicts among them in a peaceful, objective, and secure manner. Please take some time to read the following quotes on crime and punishment in the state of nature, on why a rational person would agree to form a government, and what for Locke is the origin of the Commonwealth. The second chapter is about the establishment of the government for the better protection of natural rights. What then motivates self-interested and rational persons to agree to move away from the state of nature, regardless of enjoying a lot of freedom in it, is that the government is better able to protect their rights to life, liberty, and property than they would themselves be in the state of nature. As a rational and self-interested person, I would trade my natural right to acquire private property and do with it whatever I want with a complex system of state-enacted property laws only if I have a greater assurance that the state can better protect my property than I can myself in the state of nature. For Hobbes, it was self-evident that political organization under a supreme authority was necessary and clearly better than the terrible state of nature. For Locke, the difference between the two states is not so evident. It always remains a rather open question whether one's property rights are better protected within or without a political organization. Politics for Locke then exists for the sake of protecting private property. The acts of politicians will be constantly evaluated on the basis of how well they perform in this task of securing private property and other natural rights. Locke is the first to articulate this significant view of the rationale of public life. It has received various interpretations in the history of liberalism. Today, an extreme version of this view is held by thinkers called libertarians, and we will see next week that neoliberals are also in some respects close to this Lockean view of politics. We'll come to these views and their critiques later. Locke is also the famous thinker who put forward another important idea with which you are certainly familiar. The existence of a government requires the consent of the governed. No one can be forced to exit the state of nature and the natural liberty. The existence of political society and government must be justifiable to self-interested and rational individuals and receive their agreement. In the social contract, people agree to hand in their right to enforce their own rights of life, liberty, and property to a neutral third party, the Commonwealth or the state. They alienate, hand over their right to act as a police and judge in their own case to the state. For Locke, the origin of political society cannot be violent, but it is like a contract or compact. Individuals freely decide to bind themselves into political society and become citizens of a commonwealth. Governments derive their legitimacy from the consent of the people to be governed for their own interest. The origin of political organization is the social contract, the agreement of a plurality of individuals to establish a government to rule over their common affairs. For Locke, a free person cannot be under the rule of another person and maintain his or her liberty, except if he or she has him or herself consented to be so ruled. Legitimate power over others rests on their own consent. But what is consent exactly? Most of us have never actually consented to being citizens of a country and being ruled by our government. Locke also recognizes that people actually live in societies that are already politically organized and that they have never overtly consented to being subjects of their government's rule. Actual states do not have their origins in any social contracts. Locke tries to go around this problem of people not explicitly giving their consent to their government by arguing that consent can also be tacit. This would mean that people don't have to actually express their consent verbally, but their actions can be interpreted as tacitly expressing their consent to the rule of the government of the country in which they permanently live. For example, one would agree to consent to the jurisdiction of a country by accepting inheritance from one's parents. Here, acquiring property according to the property laws of a country would mean that one accepts being governed by those laws. It is a matter of debate whether Locke succeeds in giving a plausible account of what consent actually is and what kind of consent would be required for a government to be legitimate. In any case, Locke's account of the consent of the governed is, however, an important early contribution to debates on what democracy actually entails and how political power can be democratically legitimated. We come back to questions of democracy later in the course. Here's Locke himself on the necessity of consent. Please take a moment to read it. The third chapter concerns limited government and Locke's argument against the Hobbesian-style absolute government. For Locke, the important point is that the government must protect and respect individual rights of life, liberty, and property. This sets limits to what the government can legitimately do. An absolute government that uses the citizens and their assets in any way it sees necessary for the protection of public safety is never legitimate. Locke writes, "What security, what fence is there in such a state against the violence and oppression of this absolute ruler?" It is not rational to think that people would alienate their rights to life, liberty, and property completely to the sovereign. It cannot be rationally held, Locke argues, that people would agree that the sovereign can plunder its citizens and do with their property whatever it thinks is best. The sovereign who demands absolute obedience from his subjects violates their natural freedom, their ability to themselves decide on their own affairs. Locke in fact argued against the monarchy of his time that financed itself by heavy-handedly taxing the people. He saw that the government was stealing the property of the people, forcing people to fund the lavish lifestyle of the court and the king's many wars. Locke wanted to defend the people and the people's property against theft by the state. He argued that the people do not alienate their right to their own property to the government. They only hand over their natural power to themselves, protect these rights, and act as judges in their own case. For this reason, there cannot be an absolute government that can do whatever it wishes to its subjects. A legitimate government is a moderate, limited government whose tasks and limits are defined by individual rights. The interest of all property owners, be they big or small, must be represented in political decision making. Taxation without representation is theft. So you can see here how Locke, like his fellow liberals, is skeptical about political power. Not only individuals can steal from one another, but also the state. Liberals often think that the state is always prone to take from people what they think is rightfully theirs. For this reason, public power must be tied to the constitutional principles of respecting individual rights. Please read these passages in which Locke argues why the state of nature is better than an absolute government. For Locke, the tasks of the Commonwealth are rather limited and based on the natural rights of individuals. One major task of the state is to defend the society from internal and external enemies. The state is a security and defense agency. It must keep peace. The state's or the executive power's task is to establish police and armed forces with which to defend the people and the territory of the state from attacks. Another central task of the state is legislative. For Locke, it is in fact the legislative power that is the central power of the state and not so the executive. The task of the legislative power is to enact general laws based on the law of nature. It should enact and enforce, first of all, criminal laws, defend one's life against murder and property against theft. The other type of law that the state should enact and enforce is civil law. The state should, for instance, interpret and enforce contracts into which people have entered and thus support their economic activities, see that contracts are being respected, and solve conflicts of interpretation concerning contractual obligations. The state should also enact a system of rules for the acquisition and transfer of private property. These three are the central tasks of the state. All else would intrude into the sphere of individual liberty and violate individuals' negative freedom from coercion. Note here that there is a close connection between the two sovereigns, the state and the individual. On the one hand, individual liberty defines and limits the domain of legitimate state power. And on the other hand, the rationale for the existence of state power is to safeguard individual natural rights to life, liberty, and property. The state cannot intrude into the sphere of individual liberty, and its task is to protect that sphere. Here's a quote where Locke discusses the tasks of the government. Please again pause the recording to read it. The last chapter of this knowledge clip and the final step in Locke's argument is Locke's view on political obligation. I leave it to you to figure out what Garfield has to do with political theory. All we said before entails for Locke that people's political obligation, which is their duty to obey what the government commands, is limited and conditional on the performance of that government. If the government does not protect their natural rights, people have the right to rebel, even dissolve the government and form a new one. The people retain the right to take power back from the government. In case the government misuses its powers, the sovereignty returns to the people. In fact, the people are the real sovereign behind it all. So if it happens that the government oversteps its authority by disrespecting the rule of law, which means overstepping its powers and ignoring the laws set by the legislative powers, or preventing the representatives of the people from assembling, or changing the electoral procedure without the consent of the people, or handing the people over to a foreign power, or if the government and its legislative branch systematically abuse their powers and violate citizens' rights. In all these cases, the government may legitimately be overturned and the sovereignty returns to the people, Locke argues. The Commonwealth is supposed to represent the common good, and the people should be able to trust it to do so. If the trust between the people and the Commonwealth is broken in the ways I just listed for you, the government enters into a state of war with its people as it tries to dominate them illegitimately. The people then have the right to overthrow the government. So people's political obligation is not unconditional like it was for Hobbes. Locke insists that we have to obey the authorities of our country only insofar as our government respects the rule of law, receives the consent of the people to change the mechanisms of how the laws of our country are enacted, is able to effectively protect the people against a foreign intruder, and respects our rights to liberty, life, and property in general. Please have a moment to read what Locke himself says about the reasons that lead to the government losing its legitimacy in the eyes of the public. So, in conclusion, for Locke, the aim is much less to articulate the conditions which would prevent the slide back to the state of nature than it is to articulate the criteria which would prevent tyrannical and despotic government, a government which enters into a state of war with its people. Locke was deeply concerned to protect people from an abuse of political power, which is something that he saw happening in his own time. People, their life, liberty, and property are all vulnerable to being violated by concentrated political power, so all rational and self-interested individuals will have an interest, Locke argued, to set clear limits to that power, limits within which power must be exercised. Locke's view of the state was thus deeply ambivalent. On the one hand, the state is needed to protect our life, liberty, and property, but on the other, it is itself also a threat to them. The hands of the state must be bound by law, and the parliament and the government must act within the limits set by law. For Locke, people remain the ultimate sovereign who have the right to overthrow an unjust government that systematically violates their natural rights. The state for Locke, like for Hobbes, is an artificial, contractual creation. For Locke, it is erected for the protection of the pre-political and spontaneous interaction between individuals who possess certain rights, regardless of whether the state recognizes these rights or not. Acquiring private property and the emergence of capitalist markets belong for Locke to this pre-political domain of spontaneous interaction among individuals in the state of nature. Locke presents the important argument that politics and state laws exist for the sake of protecting private property and the functioning of capitalist markets. This idea has become very influential in the centuries after Locke, and it is very much alive today. Let's, in the final two knowledge clips, see a bit more in detail Locke's labor theory of private property and its problems. Thanks for giving your time to watch this long video. I hope to see you soon in the next one.